Welcome to the Red Light Exposé podcast.
We are an international grassroots survivor-led circle.
Our goal is to counter the growing acceptance of sex work ideology.
We aim to raise awareness of the harms of commercializing sex, meaning prostitution, porn, stripping, and BDSM.
Through honest, in-depth conversations, we elevate voices often ignored and silenced.
Together, we're challenging stereotypes and dismantling myths.
We envision a healthier, safer society, especially for girls and women.
We appreciate your company on this journey.
Hi, and welcome back to another episode of Red Light Exposé. My name is Andrea Heinz, and I am one of the hosts here at this podcast project where we aim to raise awareness on the harms of commercial sexual exploitation in all of its forms. I'm here today with my close friend, Detective Dan Hall, who brings over 17 years of frontline and specialized policing experience. Beginning his career in patrol, he quickly advanced into the district operations team, where he gained extensive experience in investigations, surveillance, and operational planning. His work with the Serious Habitual Offender Program and the High Risk Offender Program placed him at the forefront of managing some of the most prolific and violent offenders, ranging from chronic youth offenders to individuals convicted of homicide, sexual violence, terrorism, and other high-risk crimes. Dan later joined the Vice team, where he investigated Asian microbrothels and human trafficking networks. In 2020, he became one of the founding members of the Firearms Investigations Team, a unit dedicated to identifying and dismantling firearms traffickers, straw purchasers, and international smuggling operations. In this capacity, he conducted complex investigations in partnership with law enforcement agencies across Canada and the United States. Promoted to detective in 2023, Daniel served with the General Investigations Unit, taking on unfolding and complex case files while also mentoring other officers. At the request of his leadership, he later assumed command of the district operations team as team sergeant, leading a team of 6 to 12 constables through high-risk investigations, operational deployments, and covert surveillance projects. In 2024, Dan joined ALERT, the Alberta Law Enforcement Response Team's Human Trafficking and Counter-Exploitation Unit. There, he created the Commercial Sex Offender Program, CSOP, in Calgary, an initiative that offers structured educational alternative measures programs for first-time offenders charged under Section 286.1 Sub 1 of the Criminal Code of Canada, obtaining sexual services for consideration. This program aims to reduce both demand and reoffending. With deep experience across offender management, human trafficking, high-risk investigations, and organized crime, Dan brings a rare, unfiltered perspective to the realities of exploitation, as well as the people, systems, and criminal networks that perpetuate it. I'm super excited to have you here today, Dan. Thanks so much for making the time to come have a conversation.
Thanks for bringing me on. I appreciate it. It's great to see you.
Yeah, you too. I know the listeners can't see us, but we can see each other, which is always helpful when we do these conversations.
Yeah, I definitely have a face for radio.
Yeah, I feel the same sometimes, definitely on a Sunday morning as we're recording. And weekends are always busy and we wake up tired. So we're in the same boat. Well, I have so much I want to pick your brain about today. And as I said, whenever I was asking you to come on here, I really think that a lot of people have, unfortunately, a misunderstanding of police in this space. And I think that there's a lot of vilification that happens of police that work in investigations, particularly around sexual exploitation. And I don't want to say it's all unjustified, as we both know, and I'm sure we'll get into later. Perhaps there is some situations, of course, where you get bad eggs that get into any kind of system and take advantage of vulnerable people. And policing, I'm sure, is no different. But I think for me, like having 13 years now of working very closely alongside law enforcement officials, since I left the prostitution system, I've really gained, I think, a lot of intimate insight into how difficult the role is of detectives, how heavy the work is, and how much the public's perception is sometimes not, really what is happening. Like there's a lot of information that doesn't seem to cross over that reaches the public, or maybe it does, but the public doesn't really fully comprehend it. So, again, not to say that there aren't detectives or officers that do sexually exploit vulnerable women or take advantage of that power in some kind of way. But I really have to say I've, like I said, garnered a really newfound respect for all that police do in this space after being there and seeing everything that goes on. Like it's far worse of a situation out there than I think people can comprehend. Would you say it's kind of the same thing where you would agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. When you look at the average day of a police officer, just in any specific role, police are never there on your best day. They're always there when things are at their worst. So it's no surprise that getting into this job that you are looked at negatively. And, sometimes you come out in quotations as the hero, but most of the time you're there because it is someone's worst day of their life. Specific to human trafficking, it's every person that we come into contact who has had some sort of exploitation involved in their life. They're brought up to say, hey, you know what, we don't really like the police. The police are never there to help. It's a lot more complex and harder than people realize for the police to assist in those situations.
Yeah, I can totally appreciate that and understand that. Again, just being adjacent to these conversations and hearing police tell me some of the stuff like, we're trying to work with a survivor or victim in this situation and we're coming across these roadblocks and, why is that happening? And oftentimes asking me, just as somebody with lived experience, like, what is the mindset of a lot of those women? Like, why are they resisting this or saying this or acting this way, but then they're saying something else, like lots of contradictory things. And what I've realized is that there's a science behind the policing in this area that is so unique to other areas of law enforcement. It really, I think, takes a very compassionate person, a very aware person with a really good critical lens to be able to fully understand kind of everything that is going on and not just taking things at face value in this space.
Absolutely. Every time that we meet a survivor, an exploited person, you have to look at the totality of it. I mean, that's not to say that we haven't come across people who try to exploit being exploited or the idea of being exploited. We've definitely come across some of those, and that's where the investigative piece comes into it. But when you find somebody who is a real life survivor having gone through that exploitation, you have to have a level of empathy in this job to understand where they're coming from and why they're coming from that point of view, right? It's hard.
Yeah, you almost need like a psych degree in addition to your law enforcement skills training, everything, right? I still learn a lot. Like I've now been in this space 20 years, like 7 years in the industry and 13 out. And every day, like when people would say like, oh, you know a lot about this, I say, I really know nothing. Like every day I learn something new that challenges a preconceived notion I had or something I once did believe. And yeah, it's sad to me sometimes that a lot of these police organizations have tenure where it's like 5 years, you've done your time on the unit, you need to be moved out now. And I can get it. Like they want, I guess, junior officers to have that exposure and that experience, or maybe they're trying to avoid, officers becoming corrupted through organized crime influence, because we know that there's a lot of influence, in that area as well. But I always think, oh my gosh, 5 years is not even enough time to really get your feet wet in these spaces. And we're seeing that right now with some of the turnover and tenure with our colleagues that you and I both know. And it's just so scary, I think, as advocates to wonder, are we going to get somebody else coming in that has that same kind of passion, has that same critical lens, that knowledge already, where they can actually be there to help the women? It's always nerve-wracking, I think, to me whenever I hear of movement.
Absolutely. Yeah, you know what? Like tenure I think, is very important for some aspects. But when you talk about having that ability to understand where people are coming from, to have that background knowledge to say, you know what, I realize that there needs to be this level of empathy and there needs to be a level of understanding of what people are dealing with on a day-to-day basis and how best to move forward, what works, what doesn't work. You need that time in the unit. You need that time speaking with people, real time speaking to people. It's different when you get some people coming into a unit and they just say, you know what, I've been investigating for 30 years. I know what I'm doing. And it's a lot different from any other type of investigation. As I've stated before in some of my presentations, is that people who are exploited through human trafficking, they don't just go through one specific sexual offense. And in policing, we have units dedicated to one specific sexual offense or one specific fraud offense or one specific anything. Whereas human trafficking is everything. When you take one person who is trafficked, they go through assault, sexual assault, threats, extortion, you name it, they go through it. And so you can't just walk into an investigative position and say, hey, you know what, I know how to do these investigations, because it's so much more complex than just that. Every time that that person tells a story, they're getting re-traumatized. Every time that they have to see their trafficker, whether it's in court or just on the street, it's potential for being re-traumatized, and it's just not worth it. We need to be able to understand what these people are going through and to be able to help them in the best way that we can.
It's very complex and very heavy work, like I said in the beginning, and makes me so grateful for the people that step up and try to do that and be there because, even for me, like after I left the industry, I worked frontline for I think it was just under 5 years as a victim advocate. So I would help women go through the court process and go and testify against, violent Johns or pimps that had been exploiting them or whatever the situation was. And the toll that took on me was so heavy to try to sit in that energy, in that space with people who are in states of crisis and, like you said, are just facing so many experiences of trauma and exploitation and mistreatment just at large. And it really, really wears people down. So maybe that's also part of why 10 years done is to stop people from falling apart. And we see that, in the ICE units, the internet child exploitation, where officers are investigating child sexual abuse and exploitation material. I think there it's like 1 to 3 years is the average time that an officer lasts, because just the weight of that is so incredibly heavy on them.
That's definitely somewhere I would not want to be honest.
Oh, me either. Never. Like, I remember being in the industry and I was finishing my correctional services diploma, and they put me for my practicum at a halfway house for long-term supervision order sex offenders. And these guys are obviously the worst of the worst with, child molestation and victimization. And at the time I wasn't a mother and I was still pretty young, and I was able, I think, to look at it a little bit more like a science, kind of like what's wrong with these guys' brains? Like, how can we fix them? How can we heal them? And I really thought, like, when I leave the industry, I really want to work with child sex offenders. And now as a mother of 3, I'm like, I could never even have to do like any of that documentation work that the officers do, because you have to watch every single one of those videos and document and, summarize what they are. And I always think like people that go into that area are just the heroes of society, because I could never do it now, especially as a parent, knowing the gravity of like what a child would experience for that. You can't look at it objectively anymore. Then it kind of becomes personal.
Yeah, it's definitely a place that leads to a lot of trauma for the officers who were involved as well, right?
Well, and I imagine it's no different for the human trafficking units either. I'm wondering if you can tell us, like, what does a typical case look like for a human trafficking detective? I know everything is unique, obviously. Like, everybody's situation is what it is in their own right, but there probably has to be some type of typical case to some degree that you could summarize for a listener who is really new to this conversation.
Well, I mean, it really just depends on what sort of investigation you're looking at from a human trafficking lens. Like, if you're talking about having a victim come forward and give a statement and say, you know what, I've been trafficked, I've been exploited, and here's the circumstances are laid out before you. That's a pretty standard, hey, that's an awesome starting point to get going from, because you have a willing witness / victim who can testify as to what's going on. When you're looking at a lot of different human trafficking investigations, we don't have that. We don't have a lot of people who want to come forward right away and say, you know what, yes, absolutely, I was exploited. I mean, it's, from my point of view, looking at it, a lot of people are trained by their trafficker not to talk to police. Police are terrible. We're bad. We're going to take you away. When you look at the Romeo pimp scenario, they're saying, well, if you talk to the police, our relationship is over. We won't be able to see each other anymore. And all of this is done. That could be scary, right? Because sometimes I think their whole world is involved in that one person. They give them everything that they need. And that's just an exploitive tactic. So when we're talking about the investigation going forward with the different types of, we'll just call them styles of trafficking, there is no one specific way to go forward with an investigation. There are techniques that are used for sure. And I'm not going to go into all of those for obvious reasons, but some of the techniques we can reuse throughout investigations, but they almost always take time. So as a lot of people who have been involved in those investigations know, we do go through cell phones and we do look at things and say what communication is happening, because that is a very important part of it. And how can we use those points to get to the actual criminal offenses involved in human trafficking? And there are multiple layers of different offenses that can occur throughout that investigation or throughout those offenses. But overall, the human trafficking investigation charge is what you're looking for. But again, every single one is different. So we might have somebody who wants to come forward, or we might have somebody who doesn't, in which case you're completely changing your tactics. You're completely changing your views. Your end result hopefully will look the same, if not better, in a victimless investigation. And when I say victimless, I don't mean that there is no victim, but I mean that the victim does not want to cooperate. We have to go forward with prosecution without having that statement there, which can be done. It just takes a lot more work. I'm a big fan of that because, as you know, a lot of people who do come forward, they recant their statements at a later date. And so everything that we've kind of been working for to try and help them, that's all kind of gone. And then the trafficker gets away with it. So if we could pursue without having to re-traumatize people, that is a win on everybody's plate, I think.
Would you say, like, what is the average length of time from, like, the moment that you become aware as an officer of a victim of human trafficking or suspected victim to a conviction, or at least a conclusion of the case if it doesn't go to trial, like the end point, so to speak? Like, what would you say those cases typically range?
Yeah, I would say probably average of at least 2 years, start to finish. Sometimes you get some information and it's a no-brainer. Like we have video, we have audio, we have cell phones, we have statements. That stuff at the onset of the investigation can go very quickly. When we don't have that stuff, asking for judicial authorization for things can take months. So not only do you have to gather the information to go into that authorization, but then you have to send it in, get it approved or signed off by a justice, and then the information gets sent to whatever agency or organization that houses that information, and they're given a set amount of time, whether it's 30 days, 60 days, whatever the case may be, to bring that back to you. Some of them are great. They send it back right away. Some take more time than they actually were given. But eventually the information does come back, and then we have to take time to go through it and make it so that it actually makes sense. So I don't know how many times I've gotten an Excel spreadsheet of information. I look at this and I got to phone the company and say, I don't understand what any of this means, right? Like I said, it's trying to get your head wrapped around all the different types of offenses, whether it's a fraud thing or whatever, but all of it has to be investigated properly to a point where, in your mind, as a police officer, beyond a reasonable doubt, this offense occurred and you have the person responsible for them. Yeah, like I said, it could take years. It really just depends on the information that is provided.
Yeah, that makes sense, right? Like the cooperation of the victim, or I don't want to say courage, because I think they're all courageous, but the readiness, I guess, would be the right term, of like them to come forward and, like you said, go through that process of testifying or being involved in the case. And then you've got the red tape on the end of things of waiting for clearances, warrant approvals, getting disclosure returned. And it sounds like there's just so many layers to it that it's not so cut and dry of, okay, here comes somebody, let's just write up a document, let's lay a charge, they said this, let's go forward. Like, I guess that's essentially the investigation component of it, right? It's like putting together pieces of a big puzzle, and sometimes not having people readily available or willing to share in supporting that puzzle building on your end. Like just kind of being like, I don't know, I'm not ready to talk about that. Or, coming from a place of fear, like you said, trauma bonding, all of that kind of stuff. Like it sounds pretty heavy. And I'm wondering, like, if there is an adjacent charge that is not human trafficking or like exploitation related. So say a firearms offense of the victim, like say that when they come forth, maybe they have like another charge, or there was a charge that's involved in that case. Would you then pull in officers from other units, or the whole file would remain yours and you would lay like an array of charges? Or are you kind of beholden to only laying charges under a human trafficking exploitation area of the criminal code?
Well, to be specific, we are police officers, so the criminal code is our everything. So there's nothing to say that we cannot lay a charge based on other evidence that we have found, and we do that all the time. Where I think it becomes important to note, and this comes with experience, I think, is that I'm not an expert in anything. Nothing at all. The only thing I'm an expert at doing is asking. So if I don't know something, I will go ask somebody who does. And having 17 years service, I've met a lot of different people who are in a lot of different units. And you mentioned about the firearms investigative team. When CPS, Calgary Police Service, when they created that team, they brought people from multiple different backgrounds, not all from organized crime or from any of those sort of gang-related things. We brought people in from everywhere. So we had somebody that came from crime scenes. We had somebody that came from the digital world. We had a gang suppression officer there. We had somebody with a drug background, somebody from human trafficking and organized crime sort of background. So when you take all those people together, everybody has unique perspectives. So it really works when you can take the experience and the level of knowledge from all these different areas and put them together. So during an investigation, we have somebody that comes in and gives a statement that there was a gun, and we find a gun on video or whatever the case may be. I think it would be pretty silly to assume that I would know absolutely everything about that specific charge without phoning somebody from the firearms investigative team to say, hey, this is our scenario. What do you think? Because not only that, our laws are changing all the time. So what was real 2 years ago may not be the fact now. So I think it's important to remember that, yes, we can lay those charges and we can rely on the information brought to us. And it doesn't even have to be police. I ran a firearms investigation where I had a silencer suppressor, and I actually went to a business in town to say, hey, what do you think of this? And I used them as experts in their field to put the information together. You have to just think outside the box and say, if I don't understand something, who can I ask? And where can I get the best information going forward?
That's a really good way to go about it, definitely, because like you said, you can't really be like the master of all, and knowing everything. Like there's just too much different, I think, angles to criminality and offending patterns and stuff like that even after 17 years, you probably just only feel like you get specialized knowledge on a couple things, but then there's just so many other areas that you'd have to be a police officer for like 300 years to even get like any really good semblance of like expertise in all those areas. And then, like you said, things are ever evolving under law and, amendments to the criminal code and procedural changes within enforcement. Yeah, it really kind of takes a village to really paint the broader picture and support one another in pursuing all those charges against people.
I think just having the courage to ask and to find out the real and right information comes back so much better for both the prosecution, but also for the victim of that offense, whatever it might be, because you're not wasting their time. You're not taking information and just like throwing it around saying, yeah, I tried. You're actually doing what you can with the information you have to go forward with the best information. I think you owe it to the victims to make sure that you know the right answer to things. And if you don't, ask.
What would you say are like some of the biggest investigative challenges that you face in trafficking cases? Like I know we talked a little bit about red tape and sometimes, not having a victim or a survivor who's willing to come forth and necessarily be all in on the investigation. But like, are there kind of overarching themes that you would say are some of the bigger investigative challenges that you face when you're going into these trafficking investigations?
I would say the trauma bond 100%. That's probably the one thing that holds up most investigations. And that's because something will happen where a call has come in and an officer responds on the street. The information is recorded into a report and it gets sent to our unit. And when we go back to try and talk to that person, to that, in quotations, victim of the offense, to try and gather more information, they don't want to talk to us because, again, like I said, they might get in trouble or they might lose that person that they, in quotations, love and loves them. So recanted statements, uncooperative witnesses, and then how do you tell someone specifically that they're being exploited by someone they trust and love? How do you gain their trust? It's incredibly difficult. That is probably the biggest thing that holds investigations back is cooperation.
And it's interesting because I think that would be something that people wouldn't expect to really be the answer because they think like, oh, I can't imagine something so horrific happening to me. And I would think when it would happen to me, if it ever did, I would really be looking for somebody to help me out of that situation or, walk me through the process of the criminal justice system. But you're right, like there's such a power dynamic at play between traffickers and their victims. And so much of it is rooted in those psychological chains. And I think that that's one of the biggest things that advocates in this space come up against, and probably police as well, is trying to get the public to understand it's not like Liam Neeson Taken movie, or snatching the person off the street and putting them in the sea can, taking them halfway around the world, chaining them to the radiator, stealing all their documentation. Like obviously there's a continuum of extremist type stuff that does happen in spaces. We're not saying, it doesn't happen in those situations, but those are far and few in comparison to what you mentioned, like the Romeo pimping. And I'm wondering if you can maybe give a little bit of a breakdown around what the difference is between the guerrilla pimps and the Romeo pimps. Like what defines them? What's their modus operandi? Like how do they get their victims to acquiesce and fall in line, so to speak, with what they want?
Well, to start off, I will just say I am a lowly police officer using a lot of big words. But the difference between the two, I think, just from my experience, whatever, Romeo Pimp is more of someone who goes in saying, you know what, I'm going to be your boyfriend, your lover, your person forever. I'm going to give you everything you need to succeed in life. And after a little while, those things start to turn around and say, okay, now, I've given you everything. I've given you food. I've given you a car. I've given you clothing. I've given you makeup, jewelry. Now it's time to, pay it back a little bit. Right? We'll just start with a little bit. And then pretty soon that debt, this person that you love has accrued on you specifically, is so big that you're never able to get out from underneath it. And there's always that underlying idea of, oh, you know what, just a little bit more and we can have a life together. We can build a house together. I just need some help with this. And as the trafficker, you're really looking to exploit people based on their feelings. And there is no feelings. They're doing this with, not every single case, but they're doing this with multiple people. So for them to feel like, oh, he loves me more than the next one, it's just not real. Whereas the guerrilla pimp style is more of the, I don't really care about you at all. I'm going to do everything I can to make sure that it is driven by fear and abuse. And you will do everything that I want you to do, regardless of what it is. And you have no choice, whether that's threats against your family, against yourself, whether it's physical trauma, sexual trauma. There's a number of different tactics that guerrilla pimps use to control their victims.
And what would you say is the breakdown? Like, I know that the portrayal of the pimp in pop culture is one typically of safeguarding the women, taking care of them, being their manager. Or you hear about the gorilla pimps, right? Like these nasty guys, but you don't ever see media portrayals of the Romeo pimp. Like, I don't think I can think of any film or book or anything. Just, I'm sure maybe they do exist, but off the top of my head, it's almost like this sensationalization sells more in this space, and people don't want to talk about like that slow manipulation, because like those Romeo pimps, like, you know, it takes time, I think, to get even young, vulnerable people to believe that they're in love with somebody. You know, it's not like an overnight thing. Whereas a gorilla pimp, it sounds like it can happen pretty quickly, right? It's an immediate threat. But I also hear that a lot of times exploiters, they're not using the gorilla pimp tactic. So they're really taking that long journey to invest, and I hate saying it that way, but like invest in their victim rather than I'm just going to go all out and start being threatening. But maybe that's because victims, I'm assuming, would probably be more able to identify that they're being exploited if they are under thumb of a gorilla pimp. Whereas, like you said, it's kind of those trauma bondings and everything that happened with the Romeo pimps. So do you see a change? Like, did it used to be when you first started in this area, like more gorilla pimps, and now we're seeing more Romeo pimps? Or has it always been the opposite, where it's predominantly been Romeo pimps? And why do you think pop culture doesn't really draw attention to those guys when we know right now, at least, they make up the majority of those pimps?
From my experience, just looking at the Romeo pimp versus the gorilla pimp and what I've seen in my career to date, I haven't come across a lot of the gorilla pimp sort of tactics. The most I see is the Romeo pimps. You got to remember that these are businesses. They're not actual relationships. They are businesses. And so, you know, there's that phrase, it takes money to make money. That's exactly what I think these Romeo pimps are doing, is they're using money to gain trust, to gain that relationship, that friend status, exploit those people who are vulnerable, give them everything that they have ever wanted, and then slowly turn it into you owe me, that sort of style, right? So it is a business 100%. When you can rely on somebody not to speak because they love you is a lot easier than somebody who beats you up and you are just afraid for your life. You're going to hit a wall eventually where you just say, you know what, I can't deal with this anymore, and let him do whatever he needs to at this point, right? Like, it's a terrible, terrible existence. But I think with media and everything like that, it's hard. I think that there are some movies out there who use that sort of style of, in quotations, pimping, not just for sexual exploitation, but for other different types of exploitation as well. And I just think that people don't understand what it looks like and how to observe it. And I mean, even in media, I would say that there's a lot of stuff out there that I've missed over the years for sure that's in there. And I'm just trying to run through my head of some of the different ones. But historically, I mean, on a bigger grand scale, someone can be put into a position of power and start telling people what they want to hear and what they need to hear, and then things just go from there, right? So it's the same style of tactics, just different outcomes.
So in your time on this unit, have you seen typically, is it pretty common? And I know maybe it's dependent on what comes across your desk, obviously. So it's maybe not indicative of the larger situation or culture, but have you seen pimps having more than one victim as the norm? Like you mentioned it being a business. So would you say that a lot of these guys have like 3, 4, 5, 6 women that they're doing this to? Or are they relatively like young guys who are just kind of getting into this exploitation game and they maybe have one victim or two? Like, what's the dynamic? Do the victims often know each other? Do they have no clue that the other exists? What does that look like when these guys are doing these tactics?
I would say that the vast majority have more than one from what I've seen. Once you bring one in and you see the type of money that you can make from this exploitation, it's not a far leap to say I could do more than one. And when you get into what's been described as stables, you start to have people that work for you to bring other people in, to go out and secure more exploited people for you. So yeah, absolutely. I don't think it's a one-off. I think that these people exploit multiple victims. And like I said before, it's a business, right? So the more people that you have being exploited, the more money you get. And people are greedy.
And, you know, it's quite alarming when you think about it, because this might be a somewhat old stat now, but I believe it was, you know, up until a few years ago, they were saying that traffickers can make about 280,000 Canadian per victim. And I think I saw somewhere that they said that that number can be upwards of like 320,000. That's kind of more current numbers. So yeah, whenever you're talking about it being a business and them having like this stable of women, even if you have like 4 or 5 women, in 1 year, that's $1 million. And it's not like these guys are paying taxes and it's a cash-based business exploitation. It's not like John's pay with credit cards. So these guys, how do they launder the money? How do they hide it? Like when you bust these guys, do you find the money under the mattress where the bed's heaving, or are they working with legitimate companies like shell companies to launder those funds?
Well, I'll tell you, with one investigation I did when I was with the Vice Unit, we had people being brought in from overseas specifically for the trafficking in quotations massage. And what we saw was that the money that was brought in to the traffickers was going into casinos, being laundered through casinos. So you go in there and they would drop down $10,000, play a couple hands, and then withdraw their money. So we saw that quite regularly. And we worked with the AGLC on that specifically.
The Alberta Gaming and Liquor Commission.
Correct, yeah, which was a great resource. And like I said before, like the more people you know, the better, right? So they're the experts in that field, so they could help us look at something and say, hey, this is exactly what we see with a money laundering scheme. So from my experience, yeah, they are laundering the money through casinos, through other businesses. Cleaning companies is a big one. Cash is king. So I've definitely gone into some of the houses and found cash everywhere, under the fridge, under the mattress, everywhere, like in books. They put money everywhere.
And then I always wonder, like, what ends up with that? Imagining that there's some place where all this stuff goes. So money, I'm assuming, probably gets saved there for a certain amount of time, but then eventually maybe goes to where? Like a victim service unit fund, or where's that go?
I'm not 100% sure, to be honest, on that one, but I know that when our investigations are finished, that the money is forfeited. And my understanding is that it does go into a victim surcharge fund, which could help victims down the road. I'm not sure if that's the case for every bit of money from different units or different areas that is seized. I can't speak to that specifically.
Yeah, that's something higher up than where we're at. Those are the decisions that we don't get to make.
Exactly, yeah.
We want to take a moment to thank you for your listenership. As an independent volunteer collective, our episodes are only made possible because of donations from people like you. Please visit our website, www.redlightexposé.com, and click the Donate tab. There, you can find ways to financially support us one time or on a monthly basis. Your support is greatly appreciated. And now, back to the episode. And so when I introduced you, I talked a little bit about your work investigating Asian microbrothels. Do you see any unique patterns that exist with any type of trafficking that's happening with predominantly Asian victims? And the reason why I asked that is because when I was in prostitution, I want to say it was about 2009-ish, maybe 2010. I had been in the industry about 3 or 4 years at that point. And Edmonton, Alberta, where I live, and I'm sure Calgary and many other cities across Canada, it seemed right around that time saw a noticeable explosion of Asian women into the licensed and unlicensed sex industry. It was almost like overnight, all of a sudden, back then we had Backpage.com. We just saw a huge growth in how many ads were posted. And suddenly, the 30 whatever brothels that we had, half of them were then owned by Asian people. There was a lot of Asian individuals going around to all of the owners and trying to buy up their brothels. And it sort of seemed like it was this very organized moving in of Asian victims predominantly. And I'm wondering, did you see anything like that? Or I know you weren't specifically on the unit at that time, you were in a different unit, but in talking to your colleagues or anything like that, like, did anybody else notice that? Or was that just something that us in the industry, we dreamt it up, or I don't know what it was, but I've talked to other advocates here that they say it was literally almost like an overnight change that happened. So do you know anything about why that happened? And there also, when you mentioned the casino, seems to be really strong ties to casinos with debt bondage with Asian individuals. So do you see that now still as well?
When I was up in the Vice Unit in 2019, that investigation into the Asian microbrothels that we did was people from all over Asia. So we had Koreans, we had Chinese, they were from everywhere. And when we actually ended up taking down the network in Calgary, we had CBSA come in and assist with the interviews and whatnot for the language barriers. And what I found was that these people are recruited from their home countries where this might not be as big of a deal as it is here, with the promise that, hey, we'll take care of everything that you need. So we'll get you here, we'll put you up in a place, we'll get you food, we'll get you advertisements, we'll pay for your headshots and your pictures, we'll arrange the dates, and all you have to do is pay us an X amount per date, depending on the time and whatever else. Anything over and above that is yours. So that's what we saw when we went into these places. We did our searches and we took the money from the actual rooms that these girls were in. They had significant cash saved up. So it was more like an opportunity for them. They would be sent back after 6 months, but here in Canada, they would be picked up, transported, given food, told where to go. Their dates would be made for them, and they would walk out of here with thousands and tens of thousands of dollars at the end of their, in quotations, tour. So it was looked at as more of a business. And we had one girl that came back several times, and she was in her probably late 40s at that time. So I think that these would be what you would call more of a willing victim coming over here on their own, say, yeah, you know what, I could do that for a little bit more money. Why not, right? They're going to take care of everything. So why not? So I think that's probably what happens. You saw a lot more of these recruiters overseas saying, hey, we'll get you into Canada for, a 6-month term or whatever the case may be. And they have those routes that they take, those different, Edmonton, Vancouver, Fort Mac, Calgary. Yep. And you just pay us that set amount per date. We'll take care of the rest. Everything over and above that is yours.
Yeah. And it's interesting because obviously it's still clearly trafficking. It's still profiting off of somebody. And I know when you said a willing victim, it might seem oxymoronic to say that, but you do see that in these spaces where people are aware that there is third-party profiteering off of their sexual exploitation. But in their mind, it's well, I'm agreeing to it, so I'm not actually being exploited. And a lot of people, I think, see similarities with that with a lot of these licensed brothels in these major metropolitan areas and these licensing regimes, right? It's the same kind of thing. What really is any different from those traffickers that are saying, hey, come over here and, you're still going to get to keep the money, but we'll arrange everything. We'll give you the space. We'll, advertise. The Johns will know to come find you here because we'll run an ad. We'll give you some semblance of security, which is never actually legitimate. But it's so strange to me how people can seemingly empathize with the situation of the women being procured overseas and brought here, even if they're keeping money. They're like, oh no, that's still wrong. But then whenever we go to talk about these licensing regimes where Asian women similarly are being exploited in those venues, the exact same setup, but they necessarily weren't brought over to Canada for that purpose. It could be somebody on an expired visa, or they're here on a student visa, or something else, whatever the dynamic. But do you see kind of parallels, I guess, with a lot of those licensing regimes and with these operations in some of those capacities? Would you consider licensing to some degree to be a form of trafficking, or do you see it differently than that?
I think when you look at these companies that want to bring people over and exploit them here in Canada or whatever the case may be, they may have the best intentions to take care of these girls when they're here. Again, it is a business for them. But how do they control what men come to see them? How do they control what these men want to do to them? And, how do these girls say no when they can't? So to me, that just makes it so much worse, right? It's not taking care of the girls. How can you vet people to come in and look after these girls? You can't do it. So I think when you're talking about the people coming in from overseas, it is still 100% human trafficking. And you're still exposing these girls to insurmountable risk, whether it be getting beat up by a person who comes to see them, or health issues, sexually transmitted infections, whatever the case may be. You can't control that, and nor are they even trying to control it. So you're just kind of saying, you know what, you come over here, you just pay us this much, we'll take care of everything else. And anything that happens to you is on your own. But they're not going to tell you that. They're just going to promise you the big money and everything like that. So looking at the difference between having somebody come from overseas and someone in Canada that's already here, you don't have to pay to bring them over. You don't have to get a visa. You don't have to do any of that work permit stuff, whether it's fraudulent or not. If they're already in Canada and they fit the profile of what you're advertising, i.e. Asian brothels, why wouldn't you, right? Why wouldn't you exploit those people for cheaper? So yeah, I could definitely see a lot of that.
Yeah. And the only reason why I ask that too is because I've had conversations with people who are still active in the industry, and it seems like they think, okay, the women who, go to the brothels, they're licensed, everything's above board, they're willing, they're doing this. But a lot of people in the industry think that as soon as you see an Asian brothel, suddenly that's trafficking. No, if those people are Asian, they're trafficked. Their English is maybe not 100%, they're trafficked. Oh, they weren't born in Canada? Oh, they're trafficked. And I sometimes feel like it's a way to do the common compartmentalization that we see all across the board in this industry. And I was guilty of that too. Whenever I was in the industry, I would be like, well, this is okay, but this is not. And this is fine, but this is not. And then, of course, once you leave the industry, you can see the whole system needs to go. There is no right way to do the wrong thing. So I struggle with people stereotyping a lot of Asian brothels as different from and I don't want to say like a Caucasian brothel, but like a brothel that is not Asian themed. And so do you see trafficking happening when it does occur in these licensed venues? Do you see it more in the Asian brothels? Does it discriminate, or is it just all across the board at any level of brothel, high end, low end?
Well, I think when you're a trafficker and you're looking for people to exploit, you don't care who they are. You have your, in quotations again, quota, whether it's to yourself, whether it's to your group, whatever the case may be, but you have your number that you need to bring in by trafficking other people. And the more people that you can do it, the better, right? So when you're looking at, let's just say we all know that these things take place outside of malls. Sephora, for instance, a perfect example, and I hate to use names, but girls go there, they hang out, they're younger, and traffickers know how to exploit the ones that are the most vulnerable. So they can see that. They're experts in these fields, so they can see those people. And I don't think it matters what race or nationality you are. If you're here or you can get them here, whatever the case may be, they're going to use that to their advantage. So I don't think that it's specific to one group. I think it's whatever's easiest at the time. I really don't think that these traffickers have any care of any part of what they're doing to these people.
And the reason why I ask that is I also think, would a Caucasian trafficker be as likely to traffic Asian women if he cannot communicate as effectively with them as he could with Canadian-born Caucasian women? It seems like if, as we know, so much of this relies on that manipulation and that control and deception. It's very strategic how they do these things. It might seemingly be harder to do that if you can't readily communicate with your victim, I'm guessing, right?
Yeah, I could see that cross over into the guerrilla pimp very quickly. So you have this person that's working for you, have a very base understanding of what's happening, and they, start saying no. Well, guess what? Now it's turned into something else. So I could definitely see that progressing more into the guerrilla pimp tactics in that case.
Early on, you had talked about survivors who aren't quite ready to leave or to testify. And I kind of want to go a little bit deeper into that because one thing, of course, that bothers me tremendously, and I'm sure it bothers you, is, well, why didn't she just leave? Right? Like, and we hear that about battered women as well, too. Well, why doesn't she just leave? And I don't think people understand, as we talked about earlier, those mental chains, that it's not a physical restraining of somebody. It's a debt bondage, maybe of a debt that isn't actually real, or, perceived authentic relationship where they believe that this person loves them. But why would you say is kind of the main reason why so many survivors aren't ready to leave or testify against their trafficker? Would you say it is that relational hope that, they're coming from a place where they haven't had a lot of feelings of support or love and they believe that this person is doing it? Or do you think it's more also a little bit of a fear of like, well, I don't want to get them in trouble, or I don't want to go through the court process and talk about having had sex for money? I'm sure it is a multitude of all of these and maybe different in each case, but is there one that you kind of see more than the other as to the reason why so many women don't want to actually leave and get into that process of exiting and healing?
Well, I think that you kind of answered that with your own statement there, which I wholeheartedly agree. There are driving factors such as fear, dependencies, feeling a lack of other options, necessities that push people into staying. Big one is fear for themselves or others, a fear of change, drug dependencies. They're only getting their drugs from their trafficker. Financial dependence, promise of things to come, trauma bond, which is attachment between a victim and their abuser, usually as a result of abuse, followed up by positive reinforcement or promises. So when you're looking at the totality of everything, and this is why I said before that not one scenario is the same as any others, because it could be one thing that's holding them, or it could be a multitude of things that are holding these people there. It could be something as simple as, I really think I love him and he's going to change. I mean, how many times have we heard that, right? And that's not exclusive to human trafficking. That's, domestic violence as well, right? Like, oh, they're going to change. It'll never happen again. This is only a one-off, but there is that shame factor as well. There's so many different reasons why people may not be ready to leave that exploitive situation. And then again, they might not realize how bad it is. They've been in it for so long. This is the norm. They're not given any choices. Choices are taken away. That's a big thing too. So having that courage to make a choice to change your life so drastically is so hard to do. I think it's a multitude of things.
Well, and yesterday, before we hit record, I was telling you about how we had a John School here in Edmonton yesterday. And we have safety network coordinators that are paired to your work in southern part of the province and then also in Edmonton North area where I'm located. And the safety network coordinator for our area here, she told the story to the men, trying to get them to understand, this trauma bonding and believing the lie that so many of these women, are, I guess, encapsulated in. And she talked about, taking a survivor of quite severe Romeo pimping trafficking. And she said, we tried to take her for a coffee and she didn't even have the confidence or the courage to order her own drink. Like she turned to the safety network coordinator and the detective and said, what can I have or what should I have? And they said like it wasn't her asking, is that too expensive or like what can I have? Like what's the limit? Or it was more like, tell me what drink I'm allowed to have. Again, not looking at the price or anything, but just I need you to direct me and tell me everything to do. So how do you get to the point of instilling confidence in these women to understand and break these mental chains? Like, I'm sure that's a really long process of deprogramming. And I look at myself, having not been trafficked, I was in the brothel system, but not third-party trafficked in the traditional sense. And even for me, like deprogramming from sex work ideology took me years, full-on years of reading and therapy and so many things that I think a lot of these women aren't in that moment, right? Because they're still so deep in survival. But how do you begin that process of trying to awaken them, so to speak, so that they can move forward?
That's a big question. You mentioned our safety network coordinators, and they are for sure the experts in that field. Asking me to give you a one-word answer, let's say, on how we can get somebody deprogrammed is never going to happen like that. We can go in and we can offer them everything under the moon, right? We can go into their hotel and give them food and give them healthcare, access to quick drugs to get them out of the situation, offer them everything that we can, and they still might say no. And that's, like you said, the programming that they've gone through and their distrust of police, what they've been taught to not trust police. So how do we get them to trust us? It's a long-term goal. We're there for them. We answer the phone when they call us, meet them for coffee, treat them respectfully, give them choices, everything that we can to make them feel as normal as possible without demanding anything in return. And I think that's the big important part is we are not there coercing them into anything. We are there giving them choices. And I think that it's a long process, and that's where our safety network coordinators are so good at their jobs. That's basically their whole thing is survivor management.
Yeah, I really appreciate them. They're really incredible women. And sometimes I think, for women who have been exploited this way, there's also a fear of men in general, typically because 9 times out of 10, maybe even more, their trafficker or somebody who has hurt them, the Johns, are all men. So then it's like, oh, here comes another man, one that, like you said, I've been told not to trust. And it's kind of now my trafficker versus him. Like that's probably the mindset that they come to. It's men competing for who's got the right narrative that will stick with me kind of thing. So yeah, once, there's already that relationship that's set up with that exploiter and it's been happening for maybe years in some of those situations, I imagine it's incredibly hard for a man to then go and somehow slightly pull her away from that situation and that individual. I think, when we look at the human trafficking conviction rates in Canada, it hovers between, I think, 10 and 12% is our conviction rate. Would you say that that's predominantly because of all these challenges, or is it more structural, maybe on like how the law is written? Do the laws not reflect the reality? Like, does something need to change on more of an institutional level? Or do you think it really still sticks at that human level of the trauma?
It's definitely a bit of both. When you're talking about the system and how we can make it better, I think the understanding is getting out there. I think that for organizations like the Alberta Centre to push the information out there is so important so that people actually understand what trafficking looks like and what people go through. I think the courts are starting to come around on things, but I think there's still a long ways to go. When it comes to convictions, if they get convicted, we've worked with offenders who have been convicted of trafficking underage people, and they're still out on the streets in their 20s. So, if we had a system in place that actually held these people accountable for the devastation they're doing to people, there would be a lot less offenders out there. Because every time they get out, we know that Canada has a very lax system. So why wouldn't they go back, make $280,000 a year off of one for 6 years in jail or 5 years in jail or whatever the case may be? So I think that's one side of it. On the other side of it is, they don't want to testify. They're afraid, or they've been brought up to not like the justice system and the police. I think that some of the challenges that we've already spoken about previously come into that. But I think there are definitely challenges on both sides.
Well said. Yesterday in the John School, as you know, a Crown prosecutor comes and talks about the laws and gives these guys kind of a real understanding of the nature of things because they're really ignorant. I don't think I've ever had a guy come through a John School in 13 years that actually understood the law, to be honest, which is pretty sad, which speaks to your point about the Alberta Centre to End Trafficking in Persons having such a key role, I think, right now in Alberta is one of those backbone organizations that can do a lot of public awareness. They're not doing frontline work, but it's really about how do we tighten up this system? How do we get everyone on the same page and in the same boat going in the same direction with the same goals here? And that's really what I think we've seen lacking in Alberta, for really across Canada, across the world, is this fragmented response to trafficking where there's not enough resources, people aren't talking to each other. There's maybe some degree of like animosity between different non-government organizations in the space because they're both competing for limited funding, or there's ego, or there's politics, there's different police attitudes, right? Like even just changing that policing culture of, they want to be there, or, people like yourself that understand it fully and are very passionate about this and are on the right course. How do we amalgamate all of that together and move forward to see success? Like, where do you think we need to start with first? Is it public education? Is it legal reform? Is it more supports for victims and survivors to come forward so that we can have more information and learn from their experiences? Is it research? Where do we start in this giant mess?
I think it's exactly that. I think it is a giant mess. And I think that it is slowly coming together when we have advocates such as yourself that want to bring light to what's happening to the people out there. I think that's probably the most important thing, education. So I think when people start understanding what trafficking looks like, how to identify it, how to stop it, how to educate their kids on what to avoid, I think that's a huge step in the right direction. With drugs, for instance, it's really interesting, and it's almost easier to spot a drug trafficker than it is a human trafficker. Drug traffickers, they're doing their things in back alleys and they're hiding things, and they've got bags that they put stuff in, and they're driving around at night, all night sort of thing, right? So from a police standpoint, you can pick those guys off, no problem. When it comes to human trafficking, they're taking their goods on the street. They're walking hand in hand with them down the sidewalk. How do you look at a man and a woman walking down the sidewalk and say, oh, that person's being trafficked? It's not that simple. So their wares are right out in the open. They don't hide it as much as they need to as the drug traffickers. So that's the education side of it, right? Yeah, let's teach our kids what to look for and how to avoid being that vulnerable victim that these traffickers look for. The law still needs some work for sure, but I think it's coming. And there needs to be some education for justices, for crowns, for defense, for everybody, right, involved. Police, 100%. Like, I'm fortunate enough to be in a human trafficking unit where you get the training and you get to learn what's happening and how to look for it and how to identify it and how to investigate and enforce with it. But the average police officer does not. And when they're on patrol on the street, they're not specific to one thing either, right? They are the jack of all trades for every criminal offense that's out there, because today they walk into a bank and they're getting a fraud. Tomorrow it's drugs. The day after that, it's guns. The day after that, it's an assault, right? So they're seeing everything, and they can't be experts in everything, but education is where it starts.
That's so true. I agree 100%. With demand, I want to say, I've met obviously many officers over the last 20 years now. And I think one thing that I immediately just really, really appreciated and admired, respected of you was that you understood the role of demand in these crimes. Because I think a lot of general lay people, but also officers, oftentimes we hear this, even still to this day, don't go after the Johns. They're not the exploiters. They're not the abusers. They're just there, they're paying the money. They're just accessing a service. Go after the traffickers. Those are the guys that aren't doing anything of value. They're just leeches that are profiteering off the women for the so-called quote unquote work that the women are doing. But you've taken a very different approach. And, Canada right now, I think only has 6 John schools. And one of them is your new program, the Commercial Sex Offender Program in Calgary. And I want to say I love the name of that program. I think it's the most apt name, and I'm partial to it, as you know, because I've been trying to push for that language shift of, these aren't clients, these aren't customers, they're not sex buyers, they're not even buying sex, because sex is non-exploitative, it's mutually desired, it's trusting, it's safe. What these guys are doing is they're buying sexual compliance. It's a form of modern day slavery, really, what they're doing, even if it's happening outside of a context of trafficking. So what do you see as the role for demand in this bigger picture? And do you think that we're doing enough to target the demand? And lastly, what was the impetus for you to start the John School?
Well, my views on the demand side of things are exactly that. It is a demand. So if people are wanting it and they can go out and find it because there's other people that are wanting it, it's not going to go away. It's always going to be there. And to do John stings, once every 3-4 months, yeah, that's good. But it needs to be prioritized. It needs to be sensationalized in the media that these things are happening. It needs to be pushed out there so that other people, not just the guys who were arrested, but other people understand that you could get arrested for this, right? And you probably will. The more John stings we put on, the more people that are going to get arrested, the bigger the information out there will be. This isn't one of those offenses where you get arrested and you go and tell your friends, hey, you shouldn't do this because everybody's ashamed of what they're doing. They know it's wrong. We asked the question, how many of you guys told people that you were here on the day, right? And
once in a while, a hand will go up, but very rarely. They're always at a work conference, an all-day Saturday work conference.
Exactly. So I think the ability to target the demand is so important. Like, for instance, if you have Calgary and you have nobody in Calgary wanting to partake in those services because they know it's illegal, then the demand will go away. I mean, that's unrealistic because it's such a big problem right now. But I mean, it is doable long run. But if we had John stings happening regularly, all the time, every second day, whatever the case may be, and guys are starting to see, wow, you know what? There's a 50% chance that this is going to be the police. It's going to be some ugly dude like Dan on the other side of the door there when I knock, right? And their whole life has changed, right? Whether their partners find out about it and their home life has changed, whether their employers find out about it and their job is now terminated as a result. I just think the more awareness that we have and the more that these people are held accountable for what they are paying into, I think the better.
So obviously that's the reason why the John School was a passion of yours, seeing like there's not always a trafficker, there's not always a third-party exploiter, but there's always a buyer in these situations. Was that kind of what nudged you to this, or was it because we've been doing it up here in the North for 30 years and you have heard stories of it or the success of it or heard from your colleagues like how important it is? What was actually the tipping point that nudged you along to say, we got to do this in Calgary too?
Well, I think a big part of it was we do the John stings and then what happens after that? So these guys are arrested, they're charged with the communication offense. And then what happens? Down here in Calgary, where realistically, could we send them up to Edmonton? That's a pretty fair distance, asking a lot of 15, 20 people be sent up to Edmonton to pay hotel rooms, to pay food, gas money, whatever the case may be. And then, the court-appointed fee on top of it, everything else. And that's when it just comes to the convicted, right? So those people who are charged and their penalty is take the John School or you're going to get convicted or whatever the case may be. So having that in Calgary, it's a lot of different things that happen when you start looking at, we need to hold people accountable for this offense of the communication part of it. And then here's an opportunity that we can take some of the pressure off the court system and then hold people accountable, show the public that we do care and that we are doing something to combat human trafficking in Calgary and Southern Alberta. I think it's a multitude of things that went together. Going out to see the Winnipeg program they have out there, the Edmonton program. To me, they are fantastic programs, and I wanted to make sure that we had something that was the same, if not better. And I think that, the willingness to change and to look at things and find out what works and what doesn't work is so important to make the program better. All these things put together kind of said, we need this here. It's something that's lacking, and let's get this up and running.
And I'm so grateful that you did that. I know in Ontario, they have a John School in London, and they also have one in Durham region. So they historically have been the province that had the most of them because they had two, and nobody else really usually has any. But Alberta, we have the longest running one since 1996 here in Edmonton. So I've always had it as a dream. We really need to be the province that has three of them, so that we are leading the way at least. And we can cover like Northern Alberta with Fort McMurray, Central Alberta with Edmonton, Southern Alberta with Calgary. Because like you said, a lot of the crowns are like, that's kind of unfair treatment, to send these guys who, some of them aren't rich. We know that a lot of Johns are not super wealthy. And some people will say, well, if they have the money to exploit, they have the money to pay the cost of answering and atoning to what they've done. But in the same degree, it's hard already to pay a $1,000 criminal code fee, basically the equivalent of a criminal code fee to take this alternative measures program. But then on top of that's, hotel, gas, everything that you said to get to that location. So if it comes down to either starting another John School or letting these guys go and not doing stings at all, or having these guys not have an opportunity to have the alternative measures program where they're going to get that education, then I think that, you definitely went about it the right way of choosing to do the program and invest all of the time that you have, all the work that you have into building that, rather than saying, well, we're just not going to do John stings, or we're going to argue with the Crown and try to send them up there, who cares? So I really just want to give my accolades to you for the work that you've done, because I really have seen just so much passion and motivation in you as an officer that I haven't seen in a lot of other officers in all these years, for actually going to the root cause of all of this, which is demand. And, that's something that our podcast, we talk about constantly, is the demand. And the Nordic model, we're very strong proponents of the equality model, the abolitionist model, because it does exactly that. It goes right to the buyers. But, there's always risk of these laws being overturned, or people are saying, well, it's not fair. It puts a women at risk if you criminalize their johns. And I think a lot of those are myths. And I think that you're on the right path. But I do want to ask, what are some of the myths on that note that you find that you come up against the most as an officer that you're either dealing with your fellow colleagues or with the public, or maybe even the victims and survivors themselves, like that deprogramming, but those societal myths that are really, really pervasive that make your job harder? Are there any of them that you see a lot?
When you're looking at something, you tend to only look at things that you understand and that you know clearly. So seeing something that you don't understand, that you don't know, it never resonates the same. It's always that kind of like, whoa, and then you're open your mind to that learning process, right? So that's where I think a lot of the myths are. Is people assume they know what human trafficking is and they know how to spot it. So one of the biggest things, like I said, someone walking down the sidewalk with somebody hand in hand doesn't necessarily mean one thing or another. But trafficking is not easy to spot. And I think that's one of the biggest myths, is that it is easy to spot. Another one is that human trafficking victims are brought in from overseas. Yeah, sure, there are some, but I think the vast majority, I can't remember the exact number, but I think it's in the 90 percentile, are from right here in Canada. And they might be from Eastern Canada, but they're still from within Canada. We have survivors and victims here in Calgary that are from Calgary. So I think that's an unrealistic thought to say that all our traffickers are brought in, like you said, in sea cans or some other method from overseas. And then another one would be victims of exploitation are always women. I'll admit that when I first got into the job, I fully expected that every victim would be female. And I was rudely awakened by my own ignorance to learn that one of the guys that we thought was a trafficker was actually an exploited person. That was a big change in my mindset on how to look at everybody. You can't just assume that it is what it looks like, because it's not always that way. So those are some of the biggest myths that I see.
Yeah, those are a lot that I see as well, too, just in the mainstream conversation. It's hard because there is such a sex-based nature to it that it is predominantly men that are buyers and predominantly women that are sold or bought by those men, right? But it is important to remember that sometimes thinking these things and not giving some kind of concession to the reality that there are men who are victims and occasionally there are women who are buyers. Again, super, super rare, but you look at like sex tourism, you look at a lot of those countries like Dominican Republic and Jamaica, you see a ton of women that go down there and they purchase the bodies of young, struggling men in those countries too. So it is hard to, I guess, accurately pay homage to the people who are victims, but also keep people focused that there is a sex-based or gender-based dynamic to these offenses. And you kind of have to make room for both of those things because you want supports to be there for all victims, regardless of what their composition is, their sex, their age, their race or ethnicity. But you also want to, look at trends and patterns and recognize that there is predominantly men on one side and women on the other side. So I think it's hard sometimes to strike that balance around meeting everyone's needs, but also getting people to understand kind of the general nature of what trafficking and exploitation looks like. And when I asked you if you would come on and have this conversation with me, the real thing I wanted us to talk about was people understanding the human cost of this work on the detectives themselves. I've really, like I said in the beginning, struggled hearing people vilify police so heavily in this space. And again, like I mentioned before, I know that there's some bad eggs, there is everywhere, but I really have seen the human toll that working in this area takes on detectives. And, we talked about that with the ICE unit, the Internet Child Exploitation Unit, and just being in these really, really heavy and dark sectors of law enforcement and spaces in society. So what has working in this space taught you about the human side of crime or, that human element? How do you kind of strike that balance between fighting for people and keeping things going and having compassion for people, but also having those things for yourself and not burning out and not losing your faith in humanity? I mean, I've gone through some dark periods where I've been it's all pointless. This is all just a waste of my time. What am I doing here? Nothing will ever change. This is just how the world is. You get into cynicism, I guess, or defeatism and burnout and jadedness that, people leave the unit and they're I can't do that anymore. Or do you think that those things can be avoided, or is that just the cost of being a really empathetic person? What has this work taught you about that human element?
I think it depends on the person specifically, but let's just say if you're an investigator and you're actually invested in the work and in what happens to these victims and survivors, I think that changes your mind a little bit on a number of different things. And one of them is, how hard are you going to work, right? Like as a police officer, you see some fines and you're like, oh, or some offenses and you're like, oh, it's a property crime, right? Like, okay, so somebody lost a bike. Is it hurting them long term? Are they going to have long term physical or emotional or psychological issues from that bike being stolen? Yeah, it's possible. But when you're talking about a victim offense like human trafficking, that isn't just one thing. It's a multitude of everything. Like I mentioned earlier, all the offenses that happen to these people, you really have to believe in what you're doing, and you have to believe that you're doing it for the right reasons. And I think that's what pushes people forward. You have to also take those mental checks. You have to talk to a therapist, make sure that you're not jaded and that you're not, looking at things the wrong way. Listen to your coworkers when they start saying, you know what, something's wrong with you, you're negative lately, or whatever the case may be. Just have those check-ins with everybody, because it is a dark place to be in sometimes. And when you see what people are capable of, yeah, it definitely messes with you, but exposure is important as well, because then you're not surprised and you have the ability to rationally think things through when you're not surprised. It is hard, but you have to have those people you depend on to have those check-ins for you to say, you know what, you're not right. You need some help. You need to take a step back. And if you have to, there's no shame in that.
It's probably a really delicate dance of not being desensitized, but not being so absorbent of the energy of those situations. Like you have to look at them to some degree objectively, but you also have to come with your compassion and your human element in order to do justice for that victim or survivor. I don't know if I could strike that balance that I see you and so many other officers strike. I think for me, like the rage and the patience that I would have to have sitting and working that long journey with people and building that rapport and helping to deprogram them a bit, like we talked about. I don't know, maybe I just like instantaneous results too much, but I just think, wow, like what warriors to walk those very difficult journeys with people who are really hurting and alone. So many of these victims, like they're looking for somebody to give them not only like support in a law capacity, but guidance in their value. Somebody to see them as something worth more than a success on a piece of paper. Oh, we got a conviction. Yay for me. Now I'll get my promotion. I think that they really want to feel like people actually care about them. And so I would imagine it's just so hard to strike that balance of staying compassionate, staying caring, but not getting jaded or angry or lost in the work. It just really seems almost harder than I think any of the work sometimes people like me do, but definitely even possibly at times even being the exploited person. It seems like even though your life is chaos, in the moment when you're being exploited, it seems to make sense to you. Like whenever I was in prostitution, like I thought I had the world figured out. I was like, oh, Civvy Sally over there is only making $20 an hour. Like what a fool. I'm making 300. I got my life just so good, but I think it's hard to be in your shoes. And I just really think that you're doing a fantastic job. And, you hear about a lot of officers that turn to alcoholism or, there's high instances of domestic violence because they've shut themselves out from their support system and they don't have anyone to connect with. And then, that aggression or anger that they're feeling for the cases that they're trying is then channeled to the people that they love. And we see, again, that with victims pushing away the people that you love, even though they're actually the ones that are there for you, and going to the people that are not good for you and giving them the love that you should be giving to your supporters. Do you see a lot of differences, I guess, in this space with how officers respond versus things like just working beats or, working a call line or something? Is that human element harder to manage in these types of areas? Because you've been on different units as well too. Like, so was it different on the firearms unit?
Every area has their niches and their little things that you never really think about. So, you brought up the firearms unit. There is a whole culture around firearms that you have to understand, because when you're going into somebody's house and taking away that, in quotations, identity of their firearms and what it means to them, that changes their mindset completely. They feel like their whole world is falling apart. So once you understand that aspect of it, you start to have a little bit more empathy. Doesn't mean that you can just say, oh, I'm not going to take these things, but you have an idea of how to talk to them and how to relate to them and bring them down from that dark place to an understanding of what is happening and where to go from there. Being in the high-risk offender program specifically, we dealt with people that were just so dark, and the things that they did but just blew my mind, and I could never understand how somebody could do some of those things. But you read those files because you're managing these offenders, and you have to know the ins and outs so to prevent this from ever happening again in the future. You start to build up that okay, why do people do the things they do? And how do you deal with that? How do you look at that, right? And don't get me wrong, there are times when I'm sitting across from somebody in an interview room and you just want to reach across the table. But is that going to help anything? No, it's really not, right? And one of the hardest things in this job is to sit across from somebody involved in one of these offenses and be civil, treat them with respect. That is such a hard thing to do. But as a professional, you kind of have to. And people expect that of you, right? The moment you bring your emotion and everything else into it, it's no longer professionalism. Everything's gone there. I mean, in my experience, I've been very fortunate being in the different areas that I've been into to come out of it with an understanding of how to look at people and how to talk to people with that empathetic view. Having never been in those situations, you just kind of have to put yourself in their shoes. How would I feel? It's tough. Yeah.
I just want to say, I think you strike a very wonderful balance of it all. I've met, like I said, quite a few officers, and some of them I think they don't do such a good job. And maybe that's just because they come to it again with like the parent lens or the personal lens of like, this goes against my morals and my values. But you're right. It really does come down to professionalism. And I struggle with that sometimes too, even facilitating John schools. Like when the guys get it, I'm like, okay, like you didn't know, you're a victim as well of sex work ideology, like the man box, everything that society tells you as a man you're supposed to be. But then there's that one guy, the last, CSOP program that we did in Calgary, the one guy at the back, I won't say who he is, but this guy, I'm from Germany. It's safer for the women. We should be doing that here. And they just can't seem to hear the message. And it's just, like you said, you could just reach out and, oh man, but you have to have that personal restraint. And sometimes it's just so hard when you understand the gravity of exactly what they're partaking in, what they're defending. And you're like, you have no clue how your position is so drastically impacting the culture, impacting the women, impacting even men, how they live their lives and how they experience the world. So yeah, I really just want to say, I think you strike a very good balance of that. And it's just been truly an honor to work alongside you and try to fight for the cause and make change together on that. And so I guess my last question is, how do you define success in this space? Like I know, again, going back to the John School yesterday that we had here, we had a Crown and he came and he said, our goal is not convictions. If you look at the American system, he said, the district attorney got 50 convictions in 1 month. Like he's stellar, he's great. And he said, but in Canada, we don't have quota goals for convictions. We just want to see that justice is served and bring forth the information and advocate on behalf of the public as a Crown prosecutor. So like, what do you see as success? Is it getting a woman out of the trafficking situation? Even if you can't get her out of that situation or she's not ready to leave, is it bringing awareness to her so that she at least knows that what is happening to her is not okay? Is it greater public education where we see then obviously a reduction in these crimes? What would kind of be the pinnacle of success for you that if you could take your magic wand and be like, okay, I'm going to make this a successful outcome, looking at all the different cases that you see, is there kind of a uniform successful outcome that you see from the work that you do?
I learned a long time ago that you can't take it personally when something that you've worked on for months and months is put into court and it's dropped right away for some weird reason. I don't think you can look at a success as the outcome in court. What I feel is a win is any time that you can extract a victim from that lifestyle and help them move forward in a positive way, and they bring that in and they hold on to that and they reach out to you as that supporting person. I think that's a win. When you can take somebody out of that life, I think that's a win. So, I mean, being an investigator is great because you can go after the traffickers, the pimps, the guys who are doing this. And that's important. Don't get me wrong. That needs to be done. But I think you also have to look at it from a survivor lens. Like, how do you take these people out of this world? You tackle the demand, yes. You interact with these people, make sure that they know that they can trust you and that you're there for the right reasons. You're not going to take advantage of them and you're there solely to help them. And that's where I said, like, our safety network coordinators are so important because they're experts in that field. And I think for me, that's the biggest thing is when you can hold people accountable for those actions and bring people out of that lifestyle.
I think that's a healthy, balanced way to look at it, and it's going back to like what I said, not like I have to get a conviction. I have to have this happen. Like you said, sometimes the courts, it's how a piece of paper was filled out or something else. Like there's always just those very clear red tape guidelines that everybody's subjected to in the work of investigating these crimes. So that's good to, do your best and hope for the best. But sometimes expecting that it doesn't always go the way that you want it to and being okay with that or accepting that, maybe not being okay with it, but accepting that sometimes that's just how it goes. So we always try to finish on one high note because we always on this podcast talk about super grim, depressing things. I'm always surprised that we have listeners at all because I'm like, oh my gosh, so heavy every conversation that we bring. But on the last positive note, what is one thing that any listener could do starting right away to help you in your work? Like what would be something that would really make a difference in your mind?
I think education. Educate themselves on what to look for, starting with the free training offered by notmycity.ca. I think just an understanding of what is happening. And no, they're not paying me for any of this stuff. I just feel that it's...
Yeah, total plug. Felt like one.
But no, I feel like that's a really easy place to start. It's free. You go on there, you can learn a little bit about what's happening and what to look for and just get an idea. Just educate yourself in any way possible. Without that education, it's just going around the same thing over and over and over, right? So branching out, learning a little bit more and how to recognize what to do.
Well, we definitely will champion people doing that 100% because the goal is eventually to get you out of a job, at least on the HT unit, right? Maybe not elsewhere, but at least in this area for sure.
I'm okay with that.
It's just been such an absolute honor. And I really appreciate your time just being so transparent about the work that you do and the issues that come about in that and the challenges that you face and the places that you see hope and potential and, opportunity for growth. So thank you so much for your work. And I really look forward to continuing our work down in Calgary and working on offender rehabilitation and whatever else comes our way.
Thanks for having me today. I really appreciate it.
We hope you found this episode informative. To follow us on social media, click the links in the show notes below. If there is a topic you would like us to cover, you can contact us at redlightexposé.podcast@gmail.com or head on over to our website, redlightexposé.com. There you can also find a donation page if you'd like to support the show. All the hosts at Red Light Exposé are volunteers, so we rely on your donations to continue to compensate our survivor guests and cover operative costs. Thank you for listening. We hope you tune in next time.